Hey, everybody. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to welcome you to Studio B and Taking Stock, 5 lessons from 2021 that will uplevel your 2022 workplace. I am Sean Walker, account executive with Studio B, and pleased to be with all of you here this afternoon. After the past 2 years, Studio B is especially pleased to offer resources to individuals, companies, and organizations of any size to support well-being. And we're so pleased that you are here to learn how we can take the lessons from the recent past and use them in our work and our lives with Dr. Tracey Meyers, one of the many outstanding teachers with Studio B. Dr. Tracey Meyers is a licensed clinical psychologist in the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. In addition to being a senior facilitator at Studio B, Tracey works at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, a legal assistance program serving lawyers, judges, and students. And in addition to her background in psychology, she is also an advanced yoga teacher, certified yoga therapist, and meditation teacher. And Tracey has authored several publications, including articles and book chapters about integrative medicine, positive behavioral support treatment for different mental health conditions, and developing collaborative relationships in healthcare settings. Her forthcoming book, Transformational Healing Through Yin Yoga Therapy, is an extensive guide to utilizing yoga and meditation to support mental health and well-being. And so we're very excited to have you, Tracey. We look forward to hearing from you right now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sean. So nice to be here and to do this is the third in a series of webinars we've been doing this fall around return to work or wherever we're working, really assessing how things are going and now looking ahead toward 2022. So today is really about that, asking some key questions, looking at how we're doing both in terms of the workplace and in our own personal well-being and how those two things intersect. So I'm going to begin and we'll start with talking a little bit about these 3 key questions. Number 1 is, how am I doing? When we're thinking about the end of the year, many of us start to think about resolutions, what we want to change, but I find it helpful to actually begin with where we are right now. So we'll spend some time today talking about personal productivity and how we're doing in that area. The second is, how am I feeling? Very different question from how am I doing, right? Often we might notice in one area of our life, our productivity may be very high, for example, but we're feeling burned out or stressed or anxious. So those 2 questions actually are really important to get to the third question. How am I thinking about my job? And how does the workplace influence the first 2 questions and vice versa? So let's dive in. So the first question of how am I doing? So our personal productivity really refers to how productive we are in different spheres of our life. And over the last 22 months, this question has come up a lot. The number 1 question I hear people say, is, are we more productive at home versus in the workplace? That's one of the questions where we often are asking. But there are a lot of other questions too about our productivity in terms of our daily responsibilities, in terms of actual output of work versus the quality of work. So let's kind of drum down a little bit further into what personal productivity is and how we can evaluate it for ourselves. So there's 6 steps in terms of looking at our personal productivity, and we're going to go through them briefly to have a sense of how do we actually answer this question thoroughly, not emotionally. Because sometimes when I ask people, and I work with a lot of lawyers, and they are very into productivity, but when I'll ask them how they're doing, they'll say, oh, I'm not productive enough. I'm not billing enough. It's usually the negative. And the truth is, until we actually assess our productivity and look at specific areas, it's really hard to answer that question thoroughly and accurately. Our negativity bias tends to creep in, and we tend to be very critical of our productivity. So we'll go through these steps so that we can have a more accurate way of actually assessing whether there are areas of growth. So first question, how productive am I on a regular basis? So number one is, what are we really able to do? And I know for myself as well that we often start with very unrealistic expectations of our productivity. And that right from the get-go creates a sense that we're underperforming. And I know if we looked at each other's to-do lists, they're often so filled with things that there was no way humanly possible in a day we could get them done. Yet we think we should be. So we're always feeling like we're underperforming. So if we actually pause, because this part is really important, and actually look at, well, what is productivity? Does it mean working faster? Does it mean really focusing with a lot of quality, good quality attention? Does it mean we're more organized? Does it mean we're using our time more wisely? So productivity is a really general term, and there are a lot of different paths that can lead to productivity once we define it for ourselves. So first, we'll talk about efficiency. That's what we usually think about when we're talking about personal productivity, like how efficient am I? And so we'll talk about that, although again, there are a lot of other nuances that I want to get to. But these ideas of like the sleep schedule, speed, this is my husband is a physician, and he found a better dictation system that actually understands him. He tends to mumble. And so he said, oh my gosh, it has saved me so much time being able to have a dictation system that actually understands me. So that can make a difference, right? Something like that. Those are those like small things that can be a huge impact in terms of your daily efficiency. The rest of these are probably very familiar. Sticking to a schedule, creating time blocks. When I, again, work with a lot of busy lawyers, we talk about blocking time so that people really feel like for this amount of time, I'm going to work on my memo or brief, right? So that sometimes a task-specific time block can be really helpful. So this is typical of what we think about with our productivity. I jumped ahead a little bit. So time management, I really like this idea of thinking about starting your day head on. This is where a lot of us kind of get hung up. I love this idea of pretending our day ends at 11 a.m. Can you imagine if like your day ended at 11 a.m. and you had to get everything done in terms of your focus, in terms of really prioritizing? That could really allow you to have a very distinct and productive period of time. I said this to my son yesterday. He's studying for his exams. He's a junior in college. I said, Jacob, just try to imagine that all your studying is going to get done by 11 a.m. And he looked at me. He's like, I'm not up at 11 a.m. I'm not even up yet. So that doesn't work for those of you who don't get up, like college juniors and seniors. But for many of us, this idea of front loading our day and really focusing on a time block rather than trying to, use the whole day, which ends up stretching out and can be less than productive. We also can use psychology. And so there's a lot of psychological research on time management. Some of you may be familiar with this Eisenhower matrix, looking at the urgency and the importance of tasks to help us figure out what we should be doing. And then the PREMAC principle, which I work on a lot with students and with, of course, with ourselves as well, that when we layer or stack a difficult task followed by a preferred task, we often can find more momentum. So that sort of the carrot and the stick, or the cupcake and the carrot idea, right? We work hard and then we have a reinforcer. I love this idea of just looking at this over time, that we can get stuck in these ruts with how we spend our time. And so shaking that up by really looking at, what's important, even just for this week alone, what tasks are vital, right? Improve focus. This is another big challenge for so many of us, especially if you're working virtually, of like, how do I stay focused and avoid this back and forth moving from one task to the other? So really, more and more, the research is showing how important it is to try to do one task all the way till the end. All of these different areas of productivity are important. And you may find, oh yeah, well, this is one of the areas I really do well at. But it's actually the time management part that I struggle with. So just, running through these in your mind and thinking about where you're strong and where you may need some support. Results. How often do you actually look at our productivity results? Do you actually have a QA person that's looking at the numbers? The most important thing is, being realistic. Again, setting goals. Sometimes I think about setting goals that are much lower than we normally would. But when we do that, we actually can be more realistic, and then we don't end up feeling like we're underperforming. And that ends up sometimes impacting our morale, our mood, and whether we even like our jobs, right? So I want to really key on that realistic standards makes a big difference. I love this idea too, that work expands to fill the time available for its completion, called Parkinson's Law. So if we had too much time, we end up wasting it, right? And we could probably all relate this to this. And not enough time, we can feel frustrated. And this cartoon really demonstrates this. So how's that big server update coming along? Not started yet. No rush. Yes, rush. It absolutely must be done by next month. It's supposed to take 3 weeks to complete. Nah, don't worry. You got to factor in how everything somehow always gets done faster on the last day before the deadline, right? And for some of us, that's really true. So we want to find that optimal level of time it takes to complete tasks. And then finally, I keep jumping ahead. I'm so sorry. Organization. So Bill Gates has said most people overestimate what they can get done in a year and underestimate what they can do in a decade. I was like, whoa, that's, again, thinking about that overestimation of our daily goals can actually create a decade where we're not performing as well because we're setting ourselves up for this kind of failure mentality at times. So organizing our physical space, looking at what prioritizes, what matters, how to eat the frog. This is a famous business model saying, and quoted, I guess, by Mark Twain originally, but the idea of taking on the hardest task first, and then not putting that off. So the same idea of having your day by 11 a.m., feeling like your day could end. And these small steps make a difference in how we feel about our productivity. So you're hearing a theme here, which is not just about the results, but how do we feel about our how we prioritize? How do we feel about our productivity? Because that's going to influence our overall job satisfaction. What keeps us from our goals? So this is the step 3. So we assess, and then we can look at these different areas. And now what actually keeps us from becoming more productive? And these are the main areas. Of course, there are others. Everyone's different. But the main areas that keep us from our goals: procrastination, high expectations, that one again of being, I would even add unrealistic expectations, deadlines we can't meet, fatigue, burnout, bigger workloads. So this across the board during the pandemic, we've heard this over and over. Same with poor communication or lack of information and not feeling appreciated. In the last webinar, we talked about how critical it is when we're giving feedback as supervisors, managers, or employers to make sure that people feel appreciated. That in fact, unless we sandwich our feedback between positive strength-based statements, people can feel very underappreciated, and it keeps people from making their own goals, right? So if they occur for prolonged periods of time, which has happened for many of us during the pandemic, we become very dissatisfied with our jobs. All right, so setting goals. This is really interesting to think about, but most people, there was a survey that said only about 16% of the employees feel that their employers set realistic goals. So that's pretty significant, meaning that they don't believe the goals are either able to, are appropriate or are achievable. And so if there's this mismatch between the goals set and the people trying to implement them, either the goals aren't going to get met, you have an unhappy employer, or as an employee, you feel really dissatisfied, so that eventually, if you feel dissatisfied enough, you're not going to stay on the job, right? And we know that there's been massive, changes in the workforce, and people more and more are saying, I'm out of here, I'm not staying. And this dissatisfaction often comes from this mismatch between goals from the employer and a person's ability to actually deliver on those goals. So that achievability in psychology and healthcare, where I have a lot of background and training, we talk a lot about achievable goals and actually being really specific about what they are, and then asking ourselves, is it actually achievable? And how do we measure it? And unless we can measure a goal, then it's actually impossible to know if it's even achievable. So that specificity is really important. And as an employee, to know what the goals and expectations are is really critical, not just this overarching, we need to do better, right? Which sometimes is how the message gets trickled down. Oops. All right. And then how do we talk to ourselves about our productivity? I alluded to this earlier, that we often feel like we're underperforming when our expectations are too high for ourselves, or unrealistic. We start to, I'm not good enough, imposter syndrome, which again, I see a lot with lawyers that I work with, where we feel like I'm faking it. I actually can't do this. So the way we talk to ourselves, the way we evaluate ourselves can play a big role in how we see our productivity, how happy we are, our stress level, and whether we want to stay at the job we're at. So Mark Twain says, there's been much tragedy in my life, at least half of it actually happened. And so our self-talk matters. A lot of studies looking at our self-talk, and we tend to have very negative self-talk. We're wired this way. 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts a day on average for most of us. And 80% of these are negative. We have this negativity bias that some of the neuroscientists have talked about. Our minds are essentially Velcro for negative. We remember the negative events. We remember the negative part of our evaluation on the job. We remember the negative feedback we get from our bosses or clients. And often those repeat over and over again. And then the ironic part about our worries, often our negative self-talk relates to worries about what might happen, and most of that doesn't actually happen. So that's just validating. And when I work with clients, one of the things I'll have them do is actually to write down their negative self-talk, what we call automatic negative thoughts, and begin to look at whether it is even helpful to engage in a dialogue, or whether it's helpful, I'm going to turn to the next slide, to be able to just say, oh, that's a negative thought. Daniel Amen, who does a lot of work on changing in the brain, he talks about these ants, automatic negative thoughts, that when we can change how we are talking to ourselves, we can make a big difference in terms of our stress level. So these are just different kinds of automatic negative thoughts that you may have experienced, most of us have, and they typically can impact our mood. So when we work with our ants, often I'll have clients make columns. So one column will be the automatic negative thought, like I'm not good enough, or I'm going to get fired if I don't do this. And then I will ask them to make another column of, is there another way to look at this? Or what would you tell your best friend? When we start to dialogue with these automatic negative thoughts, they lose some of their potency. And we go from believing it to be true to recognizing, oh, this is part of my ants. My ants are coming in. I was working with a law student the other day who's trying to get through law school, which is very stressful. And he's gotten so good at noticing his ants. He started the session, he said, I had 5 ants come in, and he read me his list. And so instead of believing them, he was able to go, oh yeah, I'm stressed. And so these ants are coming up. And he didn't let it take away from his productivity. And that was key because he's studying for exams, right? So if we can notice them without actually letting them impact us, we're going to feel better. Finally, and still we're on that very first question of how am I doing productivity wise, tracking your progress. I love tracking and looking at productivity. There's journals, there's actually productivity journals. Certainly we can look at apps that look at our productivity. And I want to do this with a compassionate view rather than a judgmental view. Can you actually look at your results with kindness and notice, oh yeah, these are areas that I'm doing well. These are areas that I still need support in. So tracking your progress is not about a report card per se, but actually this gentle inventory to look at where could you use the most support. All right, so the second question is, how am I feeling? So how am I doing? We went through that. We have different ways to assess our productivity, but the feeling part now, and you'll see that these two are related, of course. And I've already described a couple of situations where based on unrealistic expectations or feeling like you're failing, you might not feel well. But let's talk about how am I feeling? So just like our productivity assessment, we need to assess how we're feeling on a regular basis. And when I ask clients, how are you feeling? Often it's vague. People say, okay, I'm not sure, a little anxious, right? And it's not that they're trying to be avoidant. It's hard to answer that question. So I, as a psychologist, love assessments. When in doubt, I always start with, actually, let's measure this. How do we know how we're feeling unless we're actually evaluating that? So I like assessments. There's tons of psychological assessments. There's a whole business in psychology around looking at our feelings and emotions. But ones that I like in particular that look at stress level and professional satisfaction. So we have the professional quality of life scale that looks at how we're feeling on our job. We have something very simple. This one on the left is called the SUDS score, a subjective unit of distress. So on a scale from 0 to 100, how stressed am I? And you can see at the bottom, like a thermometer, 0, I'm really relaxed, and all the way to extreme distress. And it's helpful to track that on a regular basis. So we can look at stress, we can look at emotional regulation, we can look at how mindful we are. There's different measures depending on what you're looking at. But I like, in general, just to look at either stress or job satisfaction as two helpful barometers to see where I am. Once we know this, then we can begin to explore, well, what do I need to feel better? So most of us, if we look at the statistics for the last 2 years, most of us, when I say like probably close to 60 to 75% of us have struggled with anxiety. And another 40% have experienced some level of depression. So it's safe to assume that we have struggled at times with our stress level and how we're feeling, our overall quality of life, right? So in that case, it's really important to think about, well, how am I feeling? If the answer is less than optimal, what do I need to do regularly? Just like with productivity, what do I tune into regularly so that I feel better? So unlike our stress reduction kit, which is banging our head, which we can feel like we're doing sometimes, I want to just briefly mention 4 key things that help us with stress. So the first is our self-care. And I always, give this little caveat when I'm talking about self-care. Again, I'm talking to an audience, and of course with Studio B, which does so much wonderful work around self-care and well-being. But this idea that it's not an indulgence, it's actually key to the other 2 questions today about how am I doing in terms of productivity and how am I feeling about my job, if we're able to manage our self-care. And so it becomes more and more critical during these challenging times to actually look at this as it is as important as our productivity, is how much time we're spending on our stress management and well-being. So our self-care strategies, this is, such a ripe area for many of us, and it looks so different. But just like we would look at a productivity, daily schedule and routine, our self-care deserves that same careful attention. So what areas are we going to look at? Our physical well-being, our psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, professional, and we can look at what energizes me, what supports me. So the idea isn't that there's this perfect combination or that we have to do a certain amount, but it's the fact that we're paying attention. Our intention, like what matters most, really actually impacts whether we do something or not. So if our intention is to regularly do self-care strategies, that's going to play a role in whether we actually follow through or not. And from a productivity standpoint, if we put it in the day, maybe after 11 a.m. or maybe first thing in the morning, doesn't matter when, if we do that on a regular basis, we're more likely to follow through. I want to speak about some other things around self-care, because we typically think about, our physical practice, maybe yoga, meditation, physical exercise, diet, exercise, all those well-being things that are so critical. But I also want to speak about this idea of friendship and community. We know now, coming, 22 months into this pandemic, about how isolated people have felt and how good it feels to reconnect, as many of us have been able to do. But specific kinds of friendship are really critical to our overall ongoing self-care. So I like to think of, I've heard different descriptions of like our key inner circle. And I'd like you to think about for you, and this could be different for you, but I like thinking about these key people in our lives. So number 1, we need a prophet, a friend who's very willing to be a truth teller. They're compassionate, so they're not like ruthless, but they will tell you. And that really helps us to know and connect to what matters to us. So these are friends that will tell it like it is with kindness and clarity. We also need a cheerleader. Someone tells us we're doing a good job. Without that, it can feel, we can feel pretty demoralized, and our self-talk, especially our negative self-talk, can take over. We need a harasser, someone who's going to make us laugh at ourselves, not take ourselves too seriously. You just need to have teenagers to actually have people who harass you regularly, right? And then a guide. So I love this idea of having, it could be a spiritual person. It could be, a favorite TED Talk person you listen to, but someone who looks at some deeper, meaningful issues in your life. Maybe it's a circle that you go to, on a regular basis. But I like to think about it. Do we have friends that fall into these different categories? We don't just want cheerleaders because we need sometimes people to be honest with us. But we also need people that are going to deeply help us look at what matters most, right? So these are areas that I think are really pivotal to our ongoing self-care. Seeking supervision, I really find it helpful, if in your workplace you have this available, or if you would ever consider having someone in one of these roles. These are like 4 key roles that we all can use at different times of our careers, right? So a teacher is someone who gives us specific skills. So, if we go to college, we learn specific skills. If we take on a new job, we may have someone who's teaching us specific skills in that job. So supervisors often fill that role. So many of us have this. This is a very common workplace, relationship, supervisor and employee. Consultant is really interesting. Not all of us have this idea, but someone who's consulting and giving us regular feedback about how we're doing. Looking at our job performance, again, not with this critical eye, but more how do we work on mutually achievable goals? So that can be really helpful, especially when employers struggle so much with goal setting. Having a consultant come in and really look at the goals and whether there's a mismatch between expectations and goals. The coach, and so the coaching role can be really helpful, especially if you're feeling a little bit lost, feel like you're wanting to, go into a different area. And it's really critical as you're learning new skills to have someone that's kind of giving you a little bit of feedback, a little bit of cheerleading, right? Some guidance and concrete goal setting. Coaches are great at goal setting. That's not a skill that all of us have. Intuitively, we actually struggle with our own personal goal setting. So a coach can fill that role. And then finally, a mentor. And, mentors are really, really important in different job settings because they're on the same path. A mentor, I like to think of mentor as like 2 steps ahead. They can tell you their successes and their failures. And we can learn from them and feel like we're not imposters, right? So many of us struggle with that notion I talked about earlier, imposter syndrome, where we feel like we're faking it. We don't really know what we're doing. When you talk to a mentor will say, I don't know what I'm doing either, or I didn't know, or it's okay not to know, and that's the role of a mentor, and it can be really valuable. So do we need all of these at the same time? No, we may at different times want to access one of these, but I never thought about self-care as actually accessing a team of people in my life that I can reliably go to. Now, what's not in here, of course, is a therapist as well. And if our stress level is high, the therapist might play a couple of the roles in here, especially coach, consultant. But it also can help us even outside of the workplace to manage our stress. So think about it right now, like who are your core go-to team? And this could be a personal team, or it could be a professional team. And I think this team approach helps us. It does take a village. So whenever I'm thinking about someone who's struggling, I like to think, who are the key people that this person can turn to? And if there's just one person or they don't have anybody, how can we fill these roles? And we might go through a little matrix like this to figure out who can be supports in these different areas. So that brings us into this idea of self-compassion. So in order to actually be able to move and change our thinking, we have to turn toward ourselves. And this is so hard. So many of us struggle with this idea that if I'm kind to myself, I'm letting myself off easy. That's the number one thing I hear people say. Oh, self-compassion, I can be compassionate toward others, but if I let myself off the hook, I'm not going to be productive. I'm not going to do a good job. This has worked for me to be hard on myself. That's how I've gotten to where I've gotten. The research shows, Krista Neff, who you see her contact info on the bottom, has done a lot of research on self-compassion and finds that, in fact, it's the opposite. People that have self-compassion are more productive, more resilient, have less negative self-talk, and are actually better workers. 3 qualities of self-compassion. Number 1 is self-kindness. Talking to ourselves with kindness, the opposite of those automatic negative thoughts, right? So for example, if that automatic negative thought is, I am lazy, right? How many of us have had that thought? Self-compassion might say to us, oh, I've had a hard time lately because I've been stressed. I'm really motivated to want to change that, right? So it's not like denying something, but it's also bringing compassion to our experience. Second is common humanity, recognizing I'm not alone. How many of us have been stressed? How many of us have not felt up to par, right? Imagining, and sometimes I'll ask my clients, imagine all the people that are feeling just like you are. You're not alone. When we get out of our small like bubble where we feel like we are like the only one experiencing it, it can be this sigh of relief, like, oh yeah, of course, other people feel like this too. And then mindfulness, we need to bring in mindfulness, because unless we're mindful of our thoughts, feelings, automatic negative, kind of repetitious thoughts, unless we're mindful of that, it's happening under the radar. And often by the time we've actually noticed that we're not feeling well, we might have already missed opportunities to intervene. And I often, when I have people come in for counseling, we talk about what are the early detection signs? How can you tell if you're starting to slide or starting to struggle? Can we intervene earlier? Can you intervene earlier so that it's not a crisis? So you're not at the point of I quit, right? Impulsively, so that there's been this continual attunement toward yourself. So mindfulness helps us because we can actually check in. How am I feeling? What's happening right now in my body? The mindfulness meditations we can practice actually give us this capacity to be more honest with ourselves. So the self-compassion piece plays a big role in terms of realistic appraisal and also our resiliency with stress. So again, this is another way to look at the 3 components of self-compassion. So why is self-compassion so important? We know that it can increase life satisfaction. We actually feel more satisfied. If we feel more satisfied with our life, think about how that would translate into your job, right? If we're feeling pretty balanced in our life, we can take things, we can take stressors and, they can come and go. I was running this group yesterday for academic professionals. And that is a very stressful environment right now, particularly after, the pandemic, returning back to universities. So they're a very stressed out group. And one of the women the month before was just so distressed about her job, not feeling respected. She says, I'm quitting, I'm giving up. I'm getting out of the field. I'm getting out of academia, she said. This month she came back, she had this big smile on her face. And we were like, what happened? She said, I'm pregnant. And all of a sudden these things don't matter to me as much. And it was so interesting. And so she said, I was in a meeting, and this meeting I would have been so angry and upset because, I was feeling disrespected and I was feeling marginalized. And I kept thinking to myself, I feel so satisfied. I'm so happy. And she was able to feel this perspective shift because in her own personal life, she was feeling better. It was beautiful. And she actually said, I'm not going to quit the job. I actually was able to get some perspective that things matter now in a different way. Now, we don't have to have huge events like, having a baby to have that happen, that shift. But when we have self-compassion, we can see that perspective. It broadens so that we feel better. And then what looked negative or dark often can shift. Or if we do need to make a change, it's not done out of distress, right? Appreciating, so feeling happy, more body appreciation. So we feel physically better, which makes a big difference in our energy level. Our immune functioning, like that's huge. If we think about, right now we want our immunity, we want our system, our bodies to be maximally functioning. So if we're thinking and we're more kind in our thoughts toward ourselves and we're practicing mindfulness, we feel better. So self-compassion, these are things that, again, really important to notice our dialogue, our inner dialogue, being genuine about our struggles. That's why I love doing assessments. They are very compassionate. When we can assess where we are, we can actually give ourselves permission both to feel the struggle if our assessments indicate we're struggling, but also give us the motivation to, start to improve as well. This compassionate team at work, thinking about this question, where I work, does that environment allow me to feel compassionate toward myself and others? Or is it a cutthroat environment where no one cares about how we're feeling? So that's another good question. Does my workplace help me tap into my self-compassion, or does it actually harden so that I really struggle with self-compassion? Part of self-compassion is sometimes speaking the truth, being one of those truth teller friends, right? Being able to say things clearly and honestly, but not from a reactive standpoint, but from a compassionate place inside of us. We can speak the truth with compassion. Sometimes we call it fierce compassion, right? Because the goal is actually to help from a genuine place, but sometimes it does need to be fierce and direct, right? Kristen Neff, who I cited earlier, who has so many good resources about self-compassion. She has a new book out called Fierce Compassion. And she has this wonderful meditation, guided meditation that's on Insight Timer and some other things. But anyway, her meditation really speaks about how can we bring that fierce part of ourselves sometimes out so that we can do the right thing and we can affect change in our system, right? And then finding balance with our self-care strategies, which is as important as our productivity, right? In fact, it's key to our productivity. So our self-care strategies, how much are we practicing our self-care strategies? That is compassionate, to give ourselves time to do practice, right? You guys are doing that right now by attending a webinar on taking stock, right? That is self-compassion practice. Last question, how am I thinking about my job? So just to kind of go all the way, we started with productivity, and then we looked at our own stress. How are we feeling? And now if we take those two things together, how does that affect my job? So we want to have an optimal workplace. And in thinking about 2022 and where we're going, knowing that personal productivity, our stress, and our well-being matter, how does that factor into assessing our job? So once again, that same rubric of first, we have to assess some key categories to know how I want to change my job if it needs to be changed, or how I'm satisfied with my job if it feels like it's hitting the mark. So these are 5 key things to think about when you're assessing your job. And this is both from an employer and an employee standpoint. Number 1 is the relationships. You know, the relationships matter, and no matter what setting you're in, if the relationships are fractured, difficult, if there's lack of communication, it can make a huge difference in whether people stay or people go. I was consulting recently to a psychiatric group home, and that's a very stressful environment, and they're underpaid and understaffed. And one of the teams in particular functions beautifully, even though they have the same funding issues and they have the same staffing issues, but their leadership are so in tune with their staff. They know people's birthdays. They know what matters. They know when staff are burned out. They'll relieve staff. They'll literally go on the floor and say, I'm taking over. You need a break. That they're checking in continually, and their staff stay. Their staff stay because, not because they're getting paid more or because the job is easier, but because that relationship is so strong. And so that really stands out to me to think about, like, even the most difficult jobs can be doable if there's an employee-employer relationship. And then, of course, number 2, how is communication given, right? And there are so many ways that it goes wrong, right? Whether it's a terse email, whether it's a lack of explanation, whether it's vague goals, whether it's sandwiching feedback with lots of negatives rather than positives. It's so important to think about, how is the communication done on a regular basis? Is there an avenue where people are really listening to each other? Can we get on the same page? Remember that statistic I gave you early on, that only 16% of employees feel the goals that their employer set are realistic or manageable or are helpful. 16%. So that means there's a lot of room to improve on goal setting, right? And so if we can get on the same page with goals and expectations, it goes a long way in terms of communication. And that's number 3. What are we expected? What are the actual goals and expectations? And going back to that, really helpful. This one is really important too, the people's ability to feel like they can grow in an organization. And so if you're an employee, right, thinking about, what are my growth opportunities? And is there a path that would lead me toward another area that I want to go into, right? And as an employer, how are you actually working on this directly? You know, some of my best supervisors have been the ones that ask me that, like, what do you want to be working on? What growth opportunities can you work toward? Actually making that part of the expectation for the job. That's huge when there's that atmosphere that my employer wants me to grow and develop. And then the work-life balance. Does the job promote this, or does it actually, impact either directly or not so directly? Like, it might be that expectation, oh, it's fine for you to work from home this day, but in fact, everyone's in the office and you're missing out. one of my clients was saying the other day that there was a meeting and she zoomed in. Everyone else was, in person. And we've heard a lot of stories of this lately. And they forgot to turn the camera back on after lunch. She was left in the waiting room. The virtual waiting room felt really not like she was actually included. And even though she was told that it was fine to work from home. So what is that balance? What is that optimal work time? And if we are going to have people work remotely, how do we actually do that with sincerity, right? So that people feel welcomed. So the days off, there are all sorts of different ways that organizations have been working on this idea of days off, really paying, making sure people are taking the days, really encouraging people to do retreats or other, personal development, making that part of the culture. And it's a good question to ask when you're looking at your own job. Does this job provide work-life balance? I work with many law students that are looking at corporate law, and this savvy group of law students, this generation, are now asking this question: how does this law firm promote work-life balance? Because without that, we know what can happen, right? We overwork and we underdo our self-care. So these are considerations when we're assessing our job. I want to end this portion with a Steve Jobs quote, which I thought was so important. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. I love that. I'm just going to stop sharing here. I love that idea of, it isn't something we think about a lot, our heartfelt intention, like what really matters to us. And yet we spend so much time at our jobs. And so really it requires our sincere look at these elements to see if we can find satisfaction. So I want to pause here and see if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer them. If not, I'll keep talking a little bit. But, instead of setting New Year's resolutions this year, my invitation is to do a little bit of those assessments for yourself. So before setting goals, often unrealistic, like I do, right? We all do. Instead of setting unrealistic goals, actually the goal might be, how can I assess where I am? How can I look at my productivity, my well-being, and my job satisfaction, right? And so that I think is a great place to end the year and to begin the year. And as we come into this holiday season as well, to really look at our own stress level. I encourage all of you, especially the next 4 weeks or so, to incorporate something around self-compassion, whether it's taking the time to breathe, to do some movement practice, to actually explore maybe a guided self-compassion meditation, ways that we can actually find our own self and inner kindness. So thank you all so much. I'm so excited to continue to facilitate these webinars for Studio B, and thinking about the next year in 2022, about the possibilities. I think many of us have been liberated from our traditional thinking about our jobs, about what's possible, and about actually even being happy with our jobs. And so I feel like, this pandemic has opened up a lot of doors for us to really evaluate what matters most. So again, thank you all. Thanks, Jen and the crew at Studio B, and look forward to seeing you in the new year. So everyone be well, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.